Welcome to Leveraging the Changing Workforce with your hosts, Hyman Alberton and KT, Catherine Tarantino of Genesis Consulting Group. And thank you for joining us today. Our concept remains the dynamics to leveraging the changing workforce, and today's podcast title is Triage, the DEI Inflection Points, DEI, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion. It's brought to you by Genesis Consulting Group with special guest Dave Daniels. Remember, we're doing this to share knowledge and ideas to address our clients' needs and inquiries on this particular topic. We will discuss what are DEI inflection points. We'll provide a historical perspective, recent business actions and impacts contributed to affirmative action and DEI inflection points, and suggestions for triaging, stop that hemorrhaging, and provide you with knowledge and encouragement to refine your approach and thought process. Now over to my business partner, Hyman Alberton.
KT, as usual, thanks for the introduction. And Dave, thanks for joining us today as we discuss the need for DE&I triage. So recently, related to DE&I discussions, we've heard and we've used the term inflection point. But what do we mean when we use this term? There's never a lot of conversation about that. So for purposes of our discussion today, an inflection point is referenced as any event or series of events that results in a significant change, whether that change is positive or negative in the trajectory of a business. It's also important to know that inflection points have always occurred along the DE&I affirmative action journey, mostly initiated via government statutes, and has required action to address the change and the impact that we're looking for. So in order to understand really the journey, you have to have a historical perspective on inflection points. As I stated earlier, DE&I affirmative action policies and practices have existed in the workforce for quite some time. Allow me to share some inflection points which have influenced and impacted the evolution of the DE&I journey to include government statutes, executive orders, research, and current day events. So from a historical perspective, and we're going to go back to the early 1900s. Since the 1900s, several actions have occurred. These actions served as trigger points for inflection. In 1920, Congress established the Women's Bureau of the Department of Labor. And by the way, we're not going to be able to do a deep dive into these. I'm just going to give you some of the actions that took place. In 1948, President Truman ordered desegregation of the armed forces. And as you may know, that particular trigger point or action really resulted in a lot of negative perspectives about the makeup of the workforce, particularly as it related to industry, things to include manufacturing, et cetera. In the 60s, we had several things to take place. We had President Kennedy establish the Commission on the Status of Women. He passed the Equal Pay Act, which prohibited sex-based wage discrimination. And he also pushed for affirmative action in agencies. And then in 1964, we had President Johnson pass into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited discrimination based on race, sex, religion, and national origin. He also, in 1965, passed the Executive Order 11246, which basically allowed for EEO in federal agencies. Jumping into the 80s decade, we had the Hudson Institute. They published Workforce 2000. And when you jump into the 1990s, we had the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed by Congress. And then when you jump into the 2000s, we've had two events that I'm listing here most recently that most of you will remember. One was the murder of George Floyd, which had a significant impact on businesses and their commitment to DE&I. And then most recently in 2023, the Supreme Court reversal of affirmative action in colleges and universities had a significant impact, not only on colleges and universities, but it's also having an impact on businesses and federal agencies and how they move forward with DE&I and affirmative action initiatives. It's been reported that some companies have either drastically scaled back or eliminated their DE&I programs and initiatives. So a question that I have was, what was the inflection point and what was the impact. So let me just share with you a couple of companies who have really significantly scaled back their or altered their DE&I initiatives and what the inflection point was. Google is one. Google's scale back its DE&I initiatives. Reason behind that was given was due to political and financial pressures. Zoom eliminated their entire DE&I function. So it seems to be pretty drastic when you look at what they did. The National Football League and the National Basketball League both scaled back their DE&I efforts due to legal challenges and political pressure. The FBI is reevaluating its DE&I policies due to legal complaints influenced by the Supreme Court's recent ruling. And we have a drop in all DE&I initiatives amid political pressure from, quote, woke activists that was done by Harley Davidson. So those are just a few companies and the actions that they took as a result of the 2023 ruling by the Supreme Court. Dave, that leads me to a question for you as you discuss triage. And that question is, did the Supreme Court recent affirmative action ruling trigger the need for DE&I triage for DE&I to maintain its relevance? Can you comment on that?
Absolutely. Thanks, Hyman. And I think it's a really interesting question. And I certainly do believe it's impacted what's happened. But I get a sense that the wheels have been in motion over the last 12 to 18 months. I love the historical perspective that you gave because I'm a real history nerd. And I'm a real believer that history helps and can provide an opportunity for a path forward in today's inflection points as well. So, for example, I view what we're going through right now is very comparable to the late 1980s to the early 1990s. It's when I first got involved with DE&I, and that was that transition from affirmative action to D, diversity, then diversity and inclusion, and then we added the E. Most recently, I know it goes back to 2015, but probably really seriously over the last 2 to 3 years. So that's kind of a sense of where I see the inflection point right now. So I think the question is this: what can today's current DE&I leaders and HR leaders do now about the state of affairs in DE&I? My first point would be this, and I think it's a critical point. I think we all need to step back and understand that key strategies always change in any organization on an ongoing basis. I believe there's an opportunity to seize the opportunity. The other option is we can continue to debate where we're at and be concerned about that, and there's certainly reason for concern. But there's an opportunity to go from a reactive perspective to a proactive perspective and reimagine DE&I for the future. One of my best bosses and mentors that I had taught me a concept of reading the tea leaves. Now, what the heck does that mean, reading the tea leaves? Reading the tea leaves is to try to understand and try to predict and get out in front of what's happening in any particular area. And I think that's our opportunity. Let's read the tea leaves and figure out what's next. And I would suggest there are 2 phases to the approach that we should all be looking at. The first one is an interim approach. I think this is probably an 18 to 24 month perspective where there's going to continue to be some tough decisions made in organizations. There's going to be a need to step back and look at what's been done, what gave true ROI. And I think there's an analysis that needs to go on in every organization. And the question is this: was DE&I set up as a project, or was it integrated into the fabric of the strategic minds of the organization? And I've worked with a ton of different companies over the years. And unfortunately, what I have found that most often it's really been more of a project approach and not really integrated. I think the second part is more long range and where do things settle in? And there's a lot going on. And again, I want to go back and reference from affirmative action to diversity, equity, and inclusion, that didn't happen overnight. And there's some really interesting things going on with that. So with that, what I'd like to do is not just frame where I think we're at, but I also like to provide potential solutions or next steps. So I'd like to go through a few of those for you to ponder and consider. First of all, I think there's 4 corporate elements that every organization should really focus on as they go through this reevaluation process. First is succession planning. If you don't have a robust succession planning process in your organization, I would really encourage you to go back and benchmark with organizations that do a great job in that area. The second is the concept of diversity councils, and it gets called different things in different organizations. But so many diversity councils were put together with people who had a strong interest, and that was probably okay at the time. But I think diversity councils should link back to succession planning. Diversity councils should be comprised of a diverse group of high-performing individuals that are identified in the succession planning process in every organization. This should be part of their development, and this should become an expectation as they go through their corporate careers. The third piece is to step back and take a look at recruitment and selection again. Where has the money been spent? Has it been spent wisely? And where are we truly within that organization in the recruitment and selection process? The fourth area, and the one that's most dear to my heart, is the educational approach. I've had the good fortune, again, I've been involved in DE&I for decades, and I've had the good fortune of co-facilitating well over 500 different presentations. And I always find people coming up to us afterwards and they will say, you know what, that was one of the best trainings that I've ever gone through. But here's my problem. My problem is my boss doesn't know why I'm here. My boss isn't going to really support the teachings of what you've done here. And so many organizations focus on education at the middle management level and didn't really start with the leadership and get their involvement and get their buy-in. And so much money and so much time was spent, and oftentimes I would suggest didn't get a very good return on investment. And again, that's not a knock on the content or the facilitators. It's really on the approach. So I want to suggest a new approach when it comes to training. In my humble opinion, it needs to start with the leadership group and cascade through the rest of the leadership organization. I have the good fortune of being a certified coach of the Intercultural Development Inventory, and I know that's a mouthful. And so the acronym that I use is IDI. And I've had the good fortune of starting to work with a lot of executives, and I have done 500 sessions with corporate executives of companies and organizations of all sizes. And it's an opportunity to be able to help an executive understand their abilities to bring out the best in their direct reports. It's a very honest conversation, but it's done confidentially. It's done one-on-one, and it helps build confidence in leaders. It's been a very profound approach, and I'm a real fan of the IDI, and if you want more information, we're happy to share that with you. The next area, which for me is a very different approach, again, that project versus the integration approach, is what I call business unit integration. So business unit, departments, it gets called different things. For the purpose of our conversation today, I'm going to call it the business unit. Is I have a format that I go in and I work with the business unit lead, and we learn to be able to put that DE&I lens on everything that they're doing strategically. So what does this do? This brings DE&I throughout the entire organization in a very non-threatening but very effective way to bring that DE&I lens. And I found it to be a very, very powerful way to incorporate DE&I into the organizational strategy and culture. The next piece, the next recommendation is to redefine measurement. We all are familiar with traditional things like SMART, or the newest concept is FAST, that really focus on outcomes. And I'm not against that, but I believe there's a much broader, much more important aspect to measurement, and that's the concept of impact. And if you can really take a look at the impact of what you're doing strategically, I think it helps drive the right tactical steps along the way. And again, it helps incorporate DE&I into the organization as opposed to the standalone project approach. And then finally, I would really encourage us to embrace reinvention. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of dialogue going on. I like to say there's an opportunity right now to make lemonade out of lemons. And again, let's focus on the future and that potential. I'd like to see us revisit, for example, the CEO Roundtable. It's a group of almost 90 CEOs across the United States, a very strong group that went through a redefinition of the role of a CEO about 3.5, 4 years ago, pre-COVID. There's some really good stuff in there. So if you're not familiar with it, go back and take a look at that and cover that with your CEO, because it's very, very powerful. I know probably everybody listening to this broadcast knows about SHRM's new approach. And I think it's very innovative. It's been somewhat controversial, but I love the fact that SHRM was willing to put change out there, a different thought, to create the dialogue. And that's what we hope to do as well, is continue to support that dialogue for not only that interim phase, but the longer term phase as well. And of course, there's Alexander Yang's MEI, his Merit Excellence and Intelligence approach. And I always have believed, and the people that I've worked with have believed, that DE&I has always been about selecting the most qualified person, whether it's a new hire or from a promotion. And I know there's nuances to all of that, but that needs to be part of the continuing conversation as well. So hopefully those are good thought starters for you, and to continue the dialogue.
Dave, thank you for that beautiful chorus of thought starters and thinking and sharing your knowledge. Please remember IDI, Intercultural Development Inventory. Hyman and I did complete the IDI, and it allows for a personal perspective and a factual guidance. Please contact us, call, email, text, LinkedIn for further perspective, as we will provide high-value consultation. Be a part of the long-range thinking and look forward to a series of podcasts as a call to action. Thank you.